So good morning. All right, you know I'm going to do that again because I always do. Good morning. That was excellent. Now I feel like I'm running a class. On behalf of KPCC and LAist, welcome to the Crawford Family Forum for this morning's live broadcast of AirTalk. Are you all happy to be here? See Larry live? Excellent. Us too. My name's John Cohn. I manage all the live events for KPCC and LAist, and I always start out this welcome with a very important survey because we're all about data-driven stuff here. By a round of applause, how many of you are members? Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so very, very much. You make everything we do possible on air, online, and in person, and that includes KPCC and LAist. If you're not a member, you've heard Larry say it before, you can call 866-888-5722, or you can click and join kpcc.org or laist.com. Speaking of LAist, we had some very exciting news this week that you all may be aware of. We launched LAist Studios. We are in the podcast business, ladies and gentlemen, so to find out more about that, check that out online. And if you have ideas for podcasts, please pitch them to us. We are actively collecting those. Speaking of AirTalk, we will be back with a live show next Saturday, a week from tomorrow. We'll be at the Theater Days Hotel for a film week screening of Boogie Nights. So if you don't have your tickets already, I highly encourage you to get your tickets now. In person, we do a lot of different events. Check out everything we do at KPCC in person. We have returned with our Unheard LA, our community-centered storytelling series, so I hope you'll check that out as well. Any questions about any of that really important and dynamic information that I've just shared with you? All right, good. On to the really important stuff of housekeeping. Today's event is a live broadcast on 89.3 FM, and we'll be live video streaming at kpcc.org and Facebook living at KPCC in person on our Facebook account. So while it's live radio and it's live video, you don't have to be silent, but we do ask that you're respectful and in and out of segments if you're so inclined. And Larry's earned it, and if the spirit moves you, feel free to applaud to enrich that live sound experience. It would mean a lot to Larry, and he doesn't like to ask. You're welcome to use your devices. We just ask that you put them on silent. Please take a moment now, and please put those on silent. But engage with us on social media. We're using the hashtag Apollo50th, 50th, Apollo50th. Photos are okay. Please, no flash and no audio or video recording. Believe me, we got that covered. We're a media company. That's something we do fairly well. We will be doing an audience Q&A. We're going to do that after the live broadcast. You should have gotten an index card when you checked in. Please put your questions on there. Raise your hand, and some of our producers will collect those. We ask that you put your name on there, maybe where you live, and then your question. And just a subtle reminder, questions end in question marks. Just really subtle there. I think you can read between the lines. I think that about does it. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming the host of Southern California's longest continuously running daily talk program, AirTalk, and your host for the day, Larry Mantle.
I so appreciate your coming for this. I was excited to see our RSVPs for this. Came in so quickly once we announced the event. Wonderful to have you here to talk about this very historic day tomorrow, the 50th anniversary of the first walk on the moon. So first of all, just a quick show of hands. How many of you were on this earth at the time and vividly remember watching that? How many? All right, high percentage. That's great. Well, we're going to relive what that experience was like for us many years ago. And for those of you that have no memory of that, too young, not yet born, hopefully we'll recapture a bit of the essence of how powerful this event was for not just the country, but globally as well. Our panelists are going to come up momentarily and be seated. I'm not going to do a formal separate introduction because you'll hear me introduce them on the fly during the live broadcast. So you'll get a sense from our conversation why these individuals with tremendous histories related to the space program or authority on the history of the space program will be joining us over the course of this hour. As John mentioned, we'll have a portion that's off the air from the radio side to take a few questions for our guests. That'll go probably about 20 minutes or so after our live special AirTalk broadcast today. So thank you so much. We'll bring up our members of the panel and get them seated here so that we're ready to go in 2 minutes. Typically, I do a billboard, that's what we call it, right at the top of the hour. That's when you hear me describe what's coming up on the program. That I recorded earlier this morning, so that went out for the radio listeners just 3 minutes ago. We're into our local news right now with Hetty Lynn Hurdes, and then we'll come on live from here at 10:06 exactly. So I'm going to go silent for that, get my notes set, and we'll go right into that. Thank you again for coming. And as John said, when I start right up with the introduction, if you feel so moved to applaud, it's great. It lets the audience know there's a live audience here.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower cleared.
Okay, we got a roll program. Neil Armstrong reporting the roll and pitch program, which puts Apollo 11 on a proper heading.
From KPCC's Crawford Family Forum, it's a special hour of Air Talk. One small step, 50 years later. Good morning, I'm Larry Mantle. Wonderful to have you with us in our Crawford Family Forum. We've got a terrific selection of guests who'll talk about the significance of this milestone, 50 years of Apollo 11, its landing, the first moonwalk. We're also going to hear about Los Angeles County's vital role in the Apollo missions, as well as the other space missions that preceded it. We begin with John Casani, who started the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in the mid-1950s, pre-Sputnik. He was an integral part of JPL's evolution from rocket builder to designer of spacecraft. John was a leader or led missions with familiar names: Pioneer, Ranger, Mariner, Voyager, Galileo, and Cassini. He's lived the history of NASA. John, thank you for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry. Pleasure to be here.
Every 10 years, you get a chance to sort of relive the greatest technological achievement. And I just wonder over all these years, what Apollo 11 holds in your emotions today.
Well, when I think about Apollo 11, I really think of what some people refer to as the Apollo effect. Have you heard that term?
No.
Well, the effect was when the country announced its intention to put a man on the moon and return him safely in 10 years, it really created a tremendous interest among the whole country, but young people especially. And the net effect with that was that a lot of people switched career and became interested in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM. And that really started the whole STEM movement. And that formed the fundamental basis, infrastructure that enabled us to move like we have over the last 50 years into all forms of space exploration. That was the enabling. That was the trigger.
So that's what you think most about.
That's what I think most about, yes.
Anita,
kind of boring, isn't it?
No. Anita Sengupta is a rocket scientist, because it does take a rocket scientist to have this discussion. She was at JPL and in the private sector for a number of years. She's now Research Associate Professor of Aeronautics at USC. Anita, I know the human accomplishment of this means a great deal to you, but what, as an engineer yourself, what stands out most to you about the technical side of what Apollo 11 accomplished?
So I think it's probably one of the most complicated engineering feats of humanity. And so just in terms of the complexity of being able to design something for an environment that you've never been to before and have it work sort of the first time is just tremendous in terms of having to understand the physics behind everything that you're doing, whether it's from the design of the engines to the navigation of the spacecraft to what the environment was going to be for the human beings to be able to survive there for that time. So I actually can't think of a greater engineering accomplishment for our species than Apollo.
And a little bit later, we'll hear on the human side what the effect was on you and on your colleagues looking back on this. Also, his historian Peter Westwick directs the Aerospace History Project for the Huntington-USC Institute on California and the West. He's also a research professor of history at SC. And Peter, I know you're native Angelino also, grew up here in Southern California. Yep. So we tend to think of Southern California's role with NASA as all these extraordinary robotic missions. But take us back to the importance of Southern California in aerospace in the Apollo era.
Yeah, I mean, Apollo was really largely made in California, made in Southern California. A lot of both the Saturn rocket, the stages, the motors were built here, and much of the command module also, and then also components like parachutes, things like that. So a lot of Apollo, the astronauts were carried to the moon on machines that were made here in Southern California.
All right. Frances Poppy Northcutt was the first woman to work in an operational support role at NASA's Mission Control Center in Houston. She first did it for Apollo 8 and continued through subsequent missions. Poppy's featured in the new IMAX documentary Apollo 11 First Steps Edition. It's playing through September at the California Science Center and playing nationwide. The film's director, Todd Douglas Miller, provided us with this archival clip of Poppy providing a calculation to one of the flight controllers.
This is Apollo Control Houston at 79 hours, 51 minutes now onto the flight of Apollo 11. Astronaut Charles Duke has arrived on the scene.
Hey, Dave.
Yeah.
What put us 4 minutes ahead?
We arrived at the moon 4 minutes early. Speaks well for the booster.
Well, no.
Retro support, maybe on reentry support loop.
Go ahead.
Why didn't we get a post-Paris engine for that trip time? Just one of
What
these
kind of a constraint did you have in there on VR Max at that time?
37.5. That's less than that.
Well, let me put it this way. The curve with transit time of VR Max is almost straight up. So if you had run this trade-off with a 38K, you probably would have gotten it.
Yeah.
In over 11,000 hours of mission control audio, Poppy's is the only woman's voice that you hear in 11,000 hours. So she was in town last week, right here at KPCC, and I asked her about the computation that she was providing in that clip that we just heard.
We, during a mission, would work on verifying hundreds and hundreds of returns to Earth that were being just looked at, not necessarily because we planned to fly them, but because you always want to be ready and know what your alternatives are in case something comes up. So I think the thing that when people talk about this little clip that they may see, that was not a planned trans-Earth injection. That was just something that the retrofire officer was looking at as a possibility. He was looking at minimizing his trip time, and so he just really didn't realize that he needed more fuel. That was why he was having problems. He didn't have the fuel constraints high enough.
I then asked Poppy if she and her mission control colleagues had assumed that the Apollo missions were the prelude for going to Mars.
I thought we would have landed. If you talked to me during the flight of Apollo 11, I would have said, oh yeah, we'll probably be on Mars in 10, 15 years.
Wow. And so are you disappointed that here we are in 2019 and we're not there?
I'm heartbroken. I'm heartbroken. I've been heartbroken. I mean, how worse can it be that we have to hitchhike into space? We don't even have a launch vehicle yet. We haven't had a launch vehicle for years.
Well, and where do you put the blame for that? Because there was, during this era where you have an important role in the Apollo and Gemini before that, there's this feeling of everybody pulling together, can do, whatever it takes to spend. So how did the U.S. lose that in your view?
Well, you ask about where do I put the blame. I mean, maybe it should be reframed. I mean, maybe we should look at where do we put the credit for what we did, okay? And looking at it 50 years later, I sure am glad that Lyndon B. Johnson was president, because Lyndon B. Johnson is the one that got the money.
And I wondered if Poppy saw cultural differences between her NASA of the mid-'60s and the NASA of today.
I think there probably is. First of all, because go back to where we were 50 years ago and what was going on in the space race. First of all, NASA, yes, it was a civilian agency, but it was very influenced in its culture by the military. I think it's less influenced in its culture by the military at this time. You know, just because it's evolved more as a civilian agency with, you know, it still has some military feel to it, but I think that's a big difference for one thing. Also, we have an influx. We have women in positions, flight directors, flight controllers, and so forth in these non-manned missions. And if you look around the room, everybody in there is not white anymore.
In fact, it's international.
Exactly. But they're not, you know, you look at those pictures from the Mission Operations Control Room, what do you see?
Yeah.
A whole bunch of white men. In white shirts even. I mean, they're even, you know, yeah. They're even all dressed alike. They're all in what we used to call the IBM dress code.
I asked Poppy about her being the only woman in mission control and how they made her a focal point with media. And I asked her whether there was a downside to that.
Well, it was a lot of the treatment by the media was very sexist. And I would have preferred to have been the 100th woman in mission control. But I felt it was an opportunity getting out there to let other women know that women could do those jobs. And I think that that was a positive. In fact, I know for certain it was.
I was going to ask if you heard from women who saw you in those interviews or read about you.
Exactly. See, I was contacted by the Brazilian consulate 6-8 weeks ago about a woman at JPL who was a Brazilian born, Brazilian raised, who wanted to locate me because when she was a little girl, she said that she was influenced to go into planetary science because she saw news coverage of me out of Apollo 13.
That's got to be very gratifying.
Pretty amazing.
Poppy Northcutt, the first woman to work in an operational support role at NASA's Mission Control in Houston. Her missions included Apollo 11. We're marking its 50th anniversary on this special edition of AirTalk from our Crawford Family Forum at KPCC. And we remind you we're also streaming at kpcc.org. You can watch the video of this as well as listen on 89.3 KPCC. Let me go back to John Casani, who was there back from the mid-1950s all the way through these robotic as well as human missions. And I want to ask about the intensity of the space race, how this changed the work that you were doing. Because once you have Kennedy make his famous speech about sending a man to the moon, how did things change?
Well, the budget climate changed dramatically. I mean, right now the NASA budget for the last, I don't know, 20, 30, 50 years has been on the order of 0.5% of the total national budget. In the Apollo days, it was 5%. So it was a big difference.
It's hard to even comprehend. 5% of our U.S. budget was spent on NASA.
That's right. That's right. Getting ready to put people on the moon. That's what it was.
And this is the same time the Vietnam War is going on.
The same time the Vietnam War is going on. Exactly. Yeah. So I think that we were aware. We were working on spacecraft. Our job at JPL was to design and build spacecraft that could go to Venus and Mars. I led the design team for the Ranger. That was the first one. And then subsequently for Mariner 2. So we were very much aware, for instance, with Mariner 3 and 4, which is going to be the first spacecraft to Mars, that the Russians had tried it 2 years before that and had failed. And they had another spacecraft going to Mars at the same time ours was going to Mars. And so there was a lot of, we didn't want to be, we wanted to be first, but we wanted to get there, and we didn't want to have a problem like the Russians had. We didn't know what their problem was, but so the only thing we could do was focus on the things that we were working on and make sure that everything we were doing, we did it as well as it could be done. And so people were committed to that. We were working very long hours. Families were affected, and lives were affected. It was intense.
What was the feeling of what the stakes were? I mean, at the same time, so you're describing all these people, new people are coming in, the budget gets enlarged, and then what is the feeling that the stakes of your work represent?
What was
the stakes? How high are the stakes?
Oh, the stakes, yeah. Well, I don't know that we really focused on that too much. I think what we were doing was the most important thing we could think of doing. There was nothing else that competed with us, and we weren't too much focused on the Russians. I said that because we knew that was going on, but we didn't have time to worry about that. We were trying to make what we had to do, make sure that was going to work properly. So there was pressure there, but the focus of it was not the Russians. The focus of it was our own internal problems and problem solving.
Peter Westwick, I wanted to ask you in more detail about the aerospace industry. I mean, during this era, we've got Douglas, Northrop, Lockheed, North American, Hughes. I mean, all these. This is an aerospace center. Hundreds of thousands of people work in the industry. Take us back to how big a driver this was for the Southern California economy.
Right. I mean, I think when you talk to people on the street and they say, what's the industry in Southern California, LA? The industry is Hollywood, right? That's the first thing most people think about. But I mean, in this period, from World War II through this early part of the Cold War and the space race especially, I mean, the industry was aerospace. And I think most people who grew up here, like myself, understand that, every family members, neighbors, friends who worked in the industry. I mean, it was 0 degrees of separation. So many people were in the business. And it was really central. I mean, Apollo poured hundreds of millions of dollars into Southern California, and that was really what fueled this, tremendous growth of Southern California in this period.
Well, and whole communities came up around this time. Lakewood, prime example, Hawthorne, Inglewood expanded. I mean, so many of these communities either came into existence or grew tremendously.
Right, and you can trace that to the particular companies that are working on Apollo. So Rocketdyne out in Canoga Park is building the J2 and the F1 rocket motors for Saturn. And it expands hugely in this period. And that's that whole western end of the San Fernando Valley is, back then, you look at pictures before and after Rocketdyne was, nothing, and then
Reseda
suburbs.
and Winnetka and all
these.
these.
To see you rolling out the carpet. So, and that was, aerospace was driving that.
And what specifically of the Apollo mission were designed or built here in Southern California?
So you had the rocket motors out at Canoga Park and Rocketdyne, the J2 and F1 motors. The second and third stages built by North American in Huntington Beach, or in Seal Beach, and Douglas in Huntington Beach. North American and Downey built a lot of the command module that the astronauts were riding in. And then there were smaller components, the parachutes and things like this that were, the smaller suppliers around town. TRW had a hand in some stuff. So it was really dispersed across the whole LA basin in Southern California. It was really, a lot of people. The estimates kind of vary, but 40,000 is probably the low end of people who are working on Apollo in this area.
Wow. Peter, there's been a lot written by historians about how Southern California became the center of movies, and a lot of it was sort of the timing, obviously the geography, the weather. But it's interesting to go back with flight and the beginning of that, and how Southern California came to be an aerospace center. I know one of the big factors was a 1910 air exhibition held here.
Right. It was the 1910 LA Aviation Meet. It was the first international air meet held in the United States. And it was not a coincidence that it was held here in Southern California. One thing is local boosters, people like Henry Huntington and others really seized on the aircraft. Back then, 1910, this is just several years after the Wright brothers. And LA at the time was kind of a provincial burg, and they were looking for, how do we put LA on the map and what's the future? And they looked at the airplane as this is the technological future and also the industrial future. And they said, there was actually a quote from one of the local boosters who said, there's going to be a Detroit of the American aircraft industry. Let's make it happen here in LA. And they put the money in to make this air meet happen in LA instead of somewhere else in the country. And that was one of the main instigators of what then grew into this huge industry.
And I was surprised to learn how cooperative the aerospace the aeronautical companies were with each other, that we think of them all, of course they would be competitors. They're trying to, get their bid, be the winning one for a contract, but they did work together a lot.
Yeah, and it was, don't underestimate the competition. They were out to beat each other. And a lot of them did fail and go through bankruptcy and then come back. But one factor was that there was a lot of kind of cross-pollination of engineers going from one firm to another. So Jack Northrop, for example, works for Lockheed, goes for Douglas, back to Lockheed, goes off on his own. And there's this kind of peregrination of the engineers from firm to firm. And you can multiply that example by the thousands. So a lot of engineers had kind of bounced around, and there's this kind of pollination of ideas. No, I know they're doing this over at this company, and now they're doing this here. So, and following the contracts. So there was a lot of intersection.
We're talking with Peter Westwick, who is with the Huntington-USC Center on the American West, and he has been doing extensive work on Southern California's role with NASA, with aerospace, whole archives that have been put together, documentation, including oral histories and the like from people who were pioneers in the industry.
Right, and it's fascinating. And one thing that we've noticed with people, especially who worked on Apollo, is the sense, a lot of the business here was military, just defense industry. There was some commercial aircraft, but a lot of it came, especially in the Cold War, to focus on defense projects. Often classified, so you had to go through and get your security clearance and everything. And one of the things, and NASA in the 60s did have this very strong flavor of, as Poppy mentioned, of this, Air Force influence especially. But one thing about the Apollo product was it was civilian and unclassified, and you could go home and talk about the work with your wife and kids and your neighbors and friends. And that was a major appeal for the people who otherwise, if you're an aerospace engineer in the 60s, odds are you're going to be working on weapons system. And this is the era of Vietnam and some questions about, do I really want to be working on this stuff? So engineers really jumped at the chance to work on, here is this transcendent civilian mission. We're taking humans somewhere they haven't been before, as opposed to just building another kind of missile or weapon system. So some of these engineers there, they talk about it as, and I quote, Camelot.
Yeah, I'll bet.
Echoing Kennedy.
I don't know whether you had the experience growing up in Southern California, Peter, any of you attending here at the Crawford Family Forum, but I had several friends who they couldn't talk. They didn't know what their dads did when they went off to work. Their mothers didn't know what their dads did for this very reason that you described, right. Government contract work, working aerospace companies, and they just couldn't talk about anything.
Yeah, and it's really, this, and the community of this secret community was huge. At the time, back then, pretty much everybody got a clearance just by default going into the business, and you couldn't talk about this stuff. And I think, first of all, the investigations were very intrusive, and they asked very probing questions about your background and what you'd like to do. But the effects on that, on Southern California society and culture, I think historians are just beginning to really scratch the surface of what that meant for Southern California's life here, to have this, security regime superimposed on it. Very, very profound and chilling, it seems.
You're reminding me of something I hadn't thought about in years. When I was a kid, a government investigator knocked on our door to ask about our next door neighbors, and it was a man and a woman, and they started asking me as a little kid questions about the next door neighbors. So I thought, wow. Yeah. I was then asked to talk with my parents. It takes us back to a whole different climate in Southern California. We're joining you from the Crawford Family Forum at KPCC as we observe the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing and the first walk on the moon, an extraordinary event. Anita Sengupta, for many years with JPL and working in private aerospace, now professor at USC. I saw you smiling as you were listening to Poppy, and she said to us, by the way, I'm so glad Anita's going to be on the panel. I mean, she's a real rocket scientist. She does this work. So she was excited about it. What were your thoughts as you were hearing her talk?
Well, so Poppy and I did a Women in Space STEM book project together. And so I reached out to her end of last week saying, you're in LA, let's meet up so we can sign each other's books. And so she invited me to the screening at the California Science Center on Saturday. So we met, watched the movie together, and then had lunch. And so she's a hero. What she went through as a woman at NASA at that time is just kind of earth-shattering for me to think about it from my perspective. And she's brilliant, and she's actually a huge advocate for women's rights, and she's an attorney now. So I am so thankful for people like her because she basically paved the way and trailblazed for everybody else who came next.
What the Apollo 11 mission? How inspirational, significant was that for you in getting into engineering?
So I knew that I wanted to be involved in the space program since the age of 6. Obviously, I was born after Apollo program started, but I was a child of the space shuttle era. And so one of my earliest memories of the space program was the disaster, which I guess was, I forgot now if it was 1986. Yes, I was in grade school. And so we were all very closely watching Krista McAuliffe in terms of what her progress was through her training. And so we were all watching the launch. And so after that disaster, I think even as a small child, you realize sort of the risk reward of the human space program. And so we all viewed her as a hero, the fact that she put herself on the line for something like that. So that impacted me in a profound way. But I always knew that I wanted to be involved in space exploration because I'm a huge science fiction fan. So the idea of discovering what else is out there and actually putting people in the steps of where you're going to go next is kind of the holy grail.
Well, and robotic missions obviously can generate so much important science. You can send machines to places you could never send a human. What is the significance, though, for you of human missions? Why do you think they're important when robots can do so much?
So it depends upon what you think we go into space for. So I think in general, human beings are explorers by their very nature, whether or not it's exploring some new place on your vacation, whether it's not people moving around the planet trying to find new places to live and acquire land and set up cities and countries. So it's in our nature, it's in our blood, it's in our DNA to explore. So the next step for human beings is pretty obviously to actually leave our planet and to go and set up a spacefaring society beyond, whether it's to the moon or to Mars, further into our solar system, into another solar system. And so because of that nature to explore, that's the reason why people love the human space program, because they can see themselves in those astronauts, in those commercial astronauts. That being said, from an engineering perspective, the robotic space program is key to paving the way to develop the technologies in a safe, sophisticated manner so that we can feed that forward into human space exploration.
So what do you say to those who don't give so much value to our wiring to be explorers, who say, we don't have enough resources to solve our problems on this planet. Why are we putting billions of dollars into going elsewhere? What do you say to people who are skeptical?
Well, there's a really easy way to answer that question, which is if you take a look at the growth of our economy across the globe in the past several decades, most of that is due to things related to e-commerce, related to mobile telecommunications. So without the space program, we wouldn't have had the economic growth that we've seen over the past several decades. So space actually leads to growth in the economy, which leads to jobs everywhere. Now, you could make the argument now, and I think that argument is already being made, that there's now a commercial place for space exploration for people, and we see the advent of the private space sector with SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, right, where we're lowering the cost per kilogram to orbit, which facilitates this further human exploration. So now I think we have to say, as sort of like a business community, and now I'm an entrepreneur with an aerospace company, is there a business case for space? And if that's the case, now we can shift over to the private sector and start going further out into the stars using a business model for it.
So are you concerned, though, that as the private sector takes more and more of that space, that sort of the common benefit is lost? It ends up being space exploration for the wealthy.
Well, so I believe that robotic space exploration from a scientific perspective, planetary science, it's my passion. It's what I did the majority of my career. I was at JPL for 16 years. And so for me as an individual, I am so fascinated by exploring other worlds. And we have to do that robotically first for so many reasons. Probably the biggest one is radiation, right? We can't go to the Jovian system as people right now for a whole variety of reasons, but one, because the radiation will kill us. So I think there's two different paths to space exploration. There is the scientific path of understanding our place in the universe by exploring our own solar system, by exploring exoplanets, by exploring the rest of the cosmos using astronomy. And then there's this business case for space-based power, communications, and eventually manufacturing in space, like, for example, Blue Origin and Jeff Bezos want to do.
We're talking with Anita Sengupta, rocket scientist, aerospace engineer, and research associate professor of astronautics at the University of Southern California. Also with us on this special 1 hour of AirTalk, One Small Step. We're joined by Peter Westwick, director of the Aerospace History Project at the Huntington-USC Institute on California in the West. He's also a research historian at USC, professor there. And John Casani, pioneering engineer for JPL. He goes back to the mid-1950s, and he either led or was on major teams for all the various robotic and solar system missions that took place leading up to and continuing after the Apollo missions. We're going to be continuing and hearing more from our panelists on the program, and we invite you also to watch it as we stream it at kpcc.org. If you're listening to the program on our Saturday broadcast, you can also visit kpcc.org, and you can see a live stream of our conversation from the very beginning. We'll continue with that, and also want to remind you, coming up on Monday's Air Talk, it's our weekly politics panel. We'll be focused on just a little bit of political news that's taken place over the past few days. We'll talk about the controversies of the past few days, and we'll give you the very latest news as of Monday morning on that. This is One Small Step, 50 years later, as we observe the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing and the first walk on the moon. We'll be back right after this.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
From KPCC's Crawford Family Forum, this is One Small Step, 50 years later, an Air Talk special. Good morning, I'm Larry Mantle. Wonderful to have you with us. In case you just tuned in, let me reintroduce our terrific panel joining us in conversation to observe the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing and the first walk on the moon. With us, John Casani, man who's been from the beginning at JPL as a transition from building rockets to designing aircraft, to designing spacecraft, I should say. He's there from the mid-1950s all the way up through the important projects of JPL over the years. Anita Sengupta, a rocket scientist for 16 years at JPL, also working in the private industry in aerospace, and she is currently a research professor at the University of Southern California. And joining us as well, a historian who has worked very closely on putting together comprehensive archives of Southern California's role in the space race and in aerospace. Peter Westwick of the Huntington-USC Institute on California and the West. He's also a research professor, just like Anita, at the University of Southern California. All right, thank you all very much. So, John, let me go back to you to ask you about, because we were hearing about one of the reasons for doing this is the technology that decades later we get out of the projects. In the case of the Apollo mission, what are some of the things that we have that we wouldn't if not for Apollo, or at least would have been delayed?
Well, I mean, the whole spectrum of the technologies that are involved in space exploration really had their origin in the work that was done on the Apollo. So the answer to that question is everything, right? It's rocketry, it's communication, it's guidance and navigation, it's building and designing the equipment that support those functions. All of that came, its origins were with the Apollo program. And most important is what I said before, at least in my vision, it has attracted people into STEM fields. And without the young people going into engineering, science, and mathematics, we wouldn't have any of this. We were talking about, or Peter, I guess, was the fact that the military work, which was also very, very much a presence here, but it was classified. NASA comes along and we do programs that are not classified. What does that mean? That means companies like TRW, like Hughes, that were trying to build up their staff. They couldn't talk about the programs they were doing for the military, but they could put out on their advertising brochures, come work for us, we have this important job with NASA, da-da-da-da. And they could attract young people by advertising and promoting. And once they got them in there, they would put them on the NASA programs, and when they got to be really good, they switched them to the military programs, which is where the profit was. So that was another sort of a minor problem that we had. We had a lot of young turnover with the industry that we'd look to support the work we were doing. Yeah.
Anita, one of the things that we hear a lot about the computer power of Apollo was, it's hundreds of thousands of times more limited than our smartphones because of the memory and computational power. But I was reading an interesting piece that made the case that really doesn't compare the abilities, that the computer that was in Apollo 11 was extraordinarily nimble, and that the software that ran it enabled it to do all kinds of things that our phone could never do. We couldn't run an Apollo mission with our phone.
It's true, but there's it's true. It's just that there's also a weight and a power issue associated with it. So a lot of that would now be compressed into something which is much smaller, which means that you have more payload space to do something else, and you're dissipating less power. So there's it couples to the overall system design. So if you have more computationally efficient, volume efficient, mass efficient, power efficient computer skills, then it changes the way you architect your mission.
So when you look at the ability, given the state of computers at that point, for that mission to be carried out, do you marvel at what was accomplished with that?
I do, yes, and not even on the mission, but also prior to the mission. So a lot of the way we design activities now is using computational design techniques, whether that's from a structural analysis perspective, a thermal analysis perspective, an aerodynamics perspective, which is key for the reentry aspect of human spaceflight. So those capabilities didn't exist back then. They had to do sometimes 1D node calculations. They had to do so much more experimentation. So the challenge that they faced was tremendous from a design perspective because of the limitations in computational power.
So if we were to look at going to Mars again, given the state of technology today, what do you see as the biggest gaps to making that mission happen?
So for sure, in my opinion, it's a technology one. So when you land a robotic spacecraft on Mars, it has a certain amount of mass that you have to land to the surface, which is a couple of thousand kilograms, let's say. So if you have to land a human mission to surface, because you have to carry a lot of things that are unique to people, resources, consumables such as oxygen, water, and food supplies, you have to land a lot more on the surface. So entry, descent, and landing technologies are things that have to be developed specifically for the human scenario of landing people on the surface of Mars. And so that's very challenging to do because it's very capital intensive. You have to spend a lot of time drafting up test programs, which you can do here on Earth to show that it will work when you get to Mars. And then also the other element to it is radiation protection. So when you get beyond, the cocoon of Earth, you're in a very difficult radiation environment, both in the interplanetary cruise transit to Mars as well as on the Martian surface. And so those technologies from a radiation protection perspective don't actually exist yet.
So you'd have to come up with something that would be lightweight enough that would provide the degree of radiation protection that you wouldn't kill people to go to Mars.
Yes, or at least wouldn't cause you to get cancer several years later.
Yeah.
Could I throw something?
Yeah, absolutely,
I
John.
agree with everything Anita said, but I think the fundamental issue for putting people on Mars is power. We can't put people down for more than a day or two without providing the power to support them, to support the habitats, to support the fuel production, to provide the capability to live there and get off. That's where we need the breakthrough. All those other things that are required for robotic missions, they can be done. The big problem is if you want people to go to Mars and to stay there, well, they have to stay there at least 4 months. And there's dust storms and everything else, so solar panels are a problem.
Yeah, I was going to ask about solar, but that's not
Solar
reliable.
is not going to work. Solar would work on the moon where you have 2 weeks of sunlight, and then you have to have 2 weeks of battery power, so that's a big problem. But the idea of going from moon to Mars is that you want to develop the technologies that you're going to need at Mars. You want to develop them and demonstrate them at the moon, where it's much safer. You're not putting the astronauts as much risk, if you were to try something out, at Mars for the first time. You'd rather do that and get that nailed down. So technologies that are going to be used for that purpose have to be extensible to Mars. There's no point in investing the money to make it possible just on the moon.
What about nuclear? Is there a way to protect the astronauts and use nuclear power?
Well, nuclear power is the answer. There's no question about that. We're going to have space reactors. And we've made a lot of progress in that arena just in the last few years, actually. There's a program now at NASA and DOE called Kilopower, which refers to a small reactor that we've designed, built, and tested. Last year, we got through 6 months of a test program with it in February, March of last year. Very, very successful. And NASA, I think, I was going to say they're looking very seriously at it, but I think it's more than that. I don't think there is another alternative, and it's going to get developed, but it's going to take a while, too. But to go back to the moon just for 2 or 3 days, people are going to say that's Apollo on steroids. The idea is sustainability, to make living on the moon and ultimately on Mars permanent. You have to have a permanent source of power. The rest of the technology will come.
Do you support going to the moon as part of the research into going to Mars, or do you see no point in going back there?
Well, that was an argument that we had right after the Apollo program. People said, well, we go back to the moon. No, we've already been to the moon. Let's just go right to Mars. That's what Poppy was talking about, and we tried that. That was the original Constellation program that started up around the turn of the century. And we got into it, and the schedule kept slipping because we were finding new things that we hadn't thought about that were going to need to be done. The cost was going up. Finally, NASA called in a big review program. It was headed by Norm Augustine, who had been a major player in the whole aerospace industry. And he put together this big review and came back to NASA and said, look, going to Mars is simply not affordable at today's state of technology, and with the budget outlook that's all reasonable. You got to pull back, develop the technology, and then set for Mars. So that's where now it's moon to Mars. Moon is a stepping stone, and moon is a place to develop the technology that you're going to need at Mars before putting the astronauts at risk by trying it out for the first time at Mars. Yes, I support that. I think that's exactly the right step.
We're talking with John Casani, a veteran of Jet Propulsion Laboratory for decades, going back to 1955, all the way, got a front row seat for Apollo, all the other missions he worked on. We're coming your way from KPCC's Crawford Family Forum. It's one small step 50 years later as we look at the landing of Apollo 11 and the first spacewalk. Anita Sengupta, USC professor, what do you think about the moon as the step? Does that make sense?
So there's elements of the technology that can and should be demonstrated on the moon, but there's elements of the technology that can't because the moon doesn't have an atmosphere. My concern is that the challenge that we face with the space programs around the world and space exploration in general is insufficient amount of money which is being invested by governments, and therefore we look to the private sector to have that happen. So if we can use a stepping stone to the moon to actually facilitate private sector investment, because you can have, space-based power, which is beamed from the moon, or mining operations on the moon. That's also a way to help on that front. But I think there is a financial limitation. And if I had to pick one versus the other, I definitely would pick going to Mars versus the moon. But ideally, being able to do both is the right way to do it.
Peter Westwick, as a historian, I wanted to ask you about the sorts of intangibles of all this, because I look back and I think of Southern California, starts to be settled as the railroad comes to Los Angeles, brings people out, particularly from the Midwest. And so you see transportation having a huge role in the development of Los Angeles as a major city. And you mentioned aerospace earlier, coming out of this interest in aviation and exhibition and the like. And we see the Apollo and how inspirational it was for individuals. What's your sense of how all of this relates to sort of how we think of ourselves as Californians, risk-taking, entrepreneurship, the sort of notion of the California dream? Is this all entwined?
Yeah, that's that gets to kind of the heart of a lot of this stuff. And we talk about, one of the things about the earlier aircraft industry and the interest in aircraft here was it was this very kind of, we talk about blue sky thinking. In this case, literally blue sky. They were going up there and exploring this new dimension for human activity. And that a lot of this kind of taps into this it's this intangible California factor, a characteristic that California, so there's these concrete reasons why aerospace located here, research universities like Caltech, local boosters, believe it or not, cheap land and open space. But one of the factors was this kind of cultural factor of, this willingness to take risks, entrepreneurial, creative. I mean, commentators from, Richard Neutra to all the way down have talked about, California is a very creative society. And a lot of this goes back to, think about the original people who came out here for the gold rush. They're willing to take, tremendous financial and physical risks to try to make their way here in California. And a lot of that spirit animates a lot of the early aircraft industry and then endeavors like Apollo. So there's this kind of like optimistic, future-oriented approach, but it's tempered by kind of the historical reality of these kind of booms and busts of, you come out here and you try to make your way, and sometimes you fail. And a lot of the aircraft builders, a lot of the early aircraft firms failed. Space projects failed and got canceled. And even the whole aerospace industry. I mean, one of the interesting things about Apollo, the moment of the moon landing in July 1969, there was this kind of almost ambiguous tone here in Southern California because NASA's budget had already started to contract hugely, starting in 1966. And in 68, it really kind of started to drop really steeply. So by 69, the workers in the aerospace industry were really, this moment of celebration when look at the culmination of all our work over the past decade, but at the same time, they're looking over their shoulders for the pink slip. So this from 67 to 72, 50,000 aerospace jobs, about a third of the aerospace workforce in Southern California disappeared. So right at the moment of Apollo is when there's also this wave of layoffs going through the industry. And it's this really kind of interesting time of celebration, but also tempered with hard realities.
And the cultural effect I think of is so significant because you imagine just sort of the entrepreneurial risk-taking personality, but I also think of it as somewhat socially conservative at the same time. This was not a union town, unlike other major American cities, which provided opportunities for hiring without having to worry about union rules and the like. Your sense of how much that was a factor with this population of new employees.
Right, and there's this kind of interesting thing of the defense component and the security regime. All this contributes, I think, to some of the. It encourages conformity politically. I mean, if you think about another aspect of this moment here in LA in summer 1969, the mayoral election between Sam Yorty and Tom Bradley is underway, a very bitter campaign. And Yorty ends up winning. And there's a moment of, which way is LA going to tilt? And they tilt back with Yorty to this kind of conservative vision of the city. So it's this very interesting historical moment here in LA where all this stuff is kind of playing out and Apollo is right at the heart of it.
For Los Angeles is a substantial African-American population. How heavily were they employed in these engineering facilities?
Not very. Not very much. I mean, same goes for women and other minority groups. They were underrepresented. Maybe a few percent, depending on the institution. But some of that is not so much the institutional racism of the companies, but more just the fact of the engineering workforce in the nation.
The education
as a whole.
level.
They just were not going, and some of that then traces back to university recruitment. And for women, example, you go to engineering schools. Well, first of all, schools like Caltech were not co-ed. Caltech just in the early 70s goes co-ed. So, and other engineering schools were similar. So there were, the opportunities for women to enter the engineering workforce were very constrained. And then you talk to women who did go to the schools that were co-ed, and they go into the engineering building and, hey, I'm here for my first week of classes, and where's the women's restroom? That's across campus in the humanities building. So they're like, wait, what? So these are kind of obstacles, seemingly mundane, but also reflecting kind of more powerful underlying obstacles.
Yeah, briefly, Anita, what was your experience? Because you obviously come well after this, but were there vestiges at all of those cultural barriers that you and what were those?
So I'll give you my very first experience of visiting an engineering college as a 16-year-old for an engineering weekend at, I think it was RPI in New York. So we all had to stay overnight because it was 2 nights, and so I was sitting in the lounge inside of the whatever student room that I was staying in, like the lounge area, and I was just sitting on the couch watching TV, and a male jumped on top of me. Like, and I was 16, right? And so I was like, oh my God, right? Because in that school, they had like maybe 20% at most women, probably more like 15%. So that was my first experience with being in an environment which had very few women in it. So it was pretty bad
Wow,
in that
welcome
sense.
to
And
college visit.
And
Wow.
I decided not to go to that school for that particular reason. And then I went and visited another undergraduate school where they were giving me a pretty much a full scholarship, Boston University. It was a lot better in terms of women and having women's engineering programs. And so that was kind of key for me, having an environment that was healthy and safe, as opposed to my first experience.
Because there was a lot of
16-year-old.
recruitment of women going. I mean, you were quite wanted, I assume, by these, even if you didn't feel welcome when you got there.
Yes, apparently.
Not in that sense.
But I think the challenge is that, so one of the reasons why we did this book project was to get more exposure to young girls as to the fact that there are people who look like you who are on these fields. So I think the recruitment and the exposure has to happen really early on from when you're a little kid. And fortunately, my father was an engineer, so I was always exposed to what it means to be an engineer. And I never saw the gender gap because it was my dad, and you just don't think about that. But I think that's part of the challenge, is not having enough people out there who they can relate to.
Anita Sengupta, John Casani, Peter Westwick, thank you all very much for being with us, having this conversation on this very important 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing and the first walk on the moon. Let's go back to that culminating moment.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
History made, and of course, the influence of that continues 50 years later. And we thank you for joining us for this special edition of AirTalk, One Small Step, 50 years later. We appreciate it very much. We'll be back with you Monday morning at 10 for the next AirTalk here on 89.3 KPCC. Have a great weekend. And we're going to take questions from members of the audience. Do we have a wireless microphone? All right. Do you want to come? Alan in Sierra Madre, Steve from Arcadia, Heidi from Los Angeles, Michael from who knows where, Jim in Eagle Rock, and Nathan in Pasadena.
If you're here, you can come on and
Come right on up, and that way we don't have any lag time between the questions. So Alan, Steve, Heidi, in that order, Michael, Jim, and Nathan.
I don't think Alan's here. We'll start
Okay,
with Steve.
so we'll start with Steve from Arcadia. Steve, your question, please.
Really wonderful panel discussion. I'm also a JPLer since '85.
Yay.
Now, something that I always fascinated, because I had a little conversation in the before the show, somebody brought this up. How do they choose the person during the Apollo missions who would stay in the orbiting module around the moon versus the people who got to land? Were there any special qualifications, in this case for Michael Collins?
John?
I have no idea. I do remember, Colin's been interviewed many times. How did he feel about being left up there in orbit while the other guys were down on the surface of the moon, and were you lonely and all that? He was worried more about having to return home without them. That was the thing that was preoccupied his mind, that he would be not returned as a hero, but as a goat for leaving his team, leave nobody behind. So I thought that's what preoccupied his. That's my understanding. How he was chosen, I don't know. I was not part of that.
All right. Peter?
NASA had they had astronaut crew selection process, both pick who was going to be on the crew for a particular mission and then who was going to fulfill the particular roles on that mission. And they put a lot of thought into that. And there was, personal, psychological dynamics and things like that. And so they had, Armstrong was where he was, Buzz Aldrin was where he was, and Collins was where he was for definite reasons. And in this case, it seems like they got it right. Like, just understanding what we know now of their personalities, it seems like they kind of filled their particular roles pretty well.
Yes, Heidi. Yeah.
for a wonderful celebration of the anniversary. My question is, were the wives, families of the astronauts allowed private communications during the mission? Their stress was quite apparent during media coverage of the families. In fact, I was quite distressed to see that in replay in recent days, how invasive that was for them.
Yeah. And you
I only know what I saw in First Man, so I don't believe they did. I think it was quite difficult for them, so I think they kind of had to watch it with everybody, but you probably know infinitely more.
Did, as far as I know, they did not have direct communication with the astronauts. And there's a great quote, I think it was from Mrs. Cernan, to the effect of, you think it's hard to be an astronaut, try to be an astronaut's wife.
Yeah.
Michael, is it? Yeah.
Michael from Tarzana.
Tarzana, all right.
Okay. Can you go over the programming involved by MIT to get the lunar lander down to the moon, with the programming that they had to figure out to do that?
No.
You're asking about the software programming?
Yeah. I mean, how did they figure it all to go and do that?
Well, there were a lot of smart people working on that. But, you know, not much of that was done in Southern California. Most of that was done in Boston, MIT, and like Lincoln Labs, I think. And then they had simulators, and the thing that Anita was talking about. You can run a lot of experiments on computers if you know how to write simulation. That was one of the problems we had for a while with the kids coming out of school. They had never done anything where there's actually experienced a failure, because coming out of school it was all simulations, and the simulations always work correctly, and so they've never experienced the disappointment of doing something and not having it work. So we had a little problem with the younger kids in that respect. But simulation's the answer, and that was what they did for the landing. They ran the software, did the simulations, and that's it. That was it.
All right.
And they did develop the gravity turn maneuver for doing the trajectory for the final landing, which was aligning the thrust vector with the gravity vector. And the good thing on the moon, of course, is that you don't have to deal with any kind of aerodynamic forces, because it's essentially a vacuum. So that way, your situation should probably work well. Hazard avoidance, I think, was far more difficult. And so I believe for the final portion of that, Armstrong actually had to fly out a lot of what he saw, which were dangerous places to land, to get to something which was safe to land.
Speaking of 50 years ago, a Pup and Taco T-shirt. I love that. That's one of the best shirts I've seen in a long time. Wow, you're taking me back. Jim from Eagle Rock.
I know there's always a lot of out-of-the-box thinking when you're crunching things. And this is more for John, because can you tell me more about using dogs to explore the moon?
You say dogs?
Yeah.
Well, at one time, JPL had a group of people that went back to Washington very early in the Apollo program to help come up with the architecture, how you're actually going to go about doing that. And when they came back, and we were talking to them, and I said, "What the heck do you want to put people on the moon for anyway? It's not a natural place for people to be, and it's going to be difficult because you have to bring them back." And somebody said, "Well, the Navy has trained dolphins to do things in the water, and the Army Air Force had pigeons pecking on bomb sites, and they were trained to do something. Why don't we train some dogs and send them to the moon? And they can be trained to use a dog hammer, they'd be as good as a geologist, and the advantage is that you don't have to bring the dog back. So he can rest in peace." Well, I guess there was a whole group of Mothers Against Dead Dogs on the moon, and we could never get it past the SPCA. It was sort of a tongue-in-cheek thing, but it was kind of interesting, and that's about as far. The Russians flew dogs, of course, right? And they didn't survive. And I don't know what happened to the monkeys. You probably know that. They flew monkeys. But,
we flew monkeys.
Yeah.
And brought them back.
Yeah. I think they flew a cat as well, the Russians, right?
Yeah. Anita, that probably wouldn't have been as inspirational for you.
And I'm a cat person, so I don't want to do anything to cats. But I would say the one thing which we can do now, because of the advent of technology, is to actually use robots which have great articulation with augmented reality, so a person could control a robot to do a lot of the work on the surface of some location if they were staying in a habitat or something like that. So Robonaut is something which is under development at NASA, and clearly tons and tons of robots are being developed for those kinds of menial tasks, even for things on Earth.
You think that the robot using the augmented reality you're talking about could do everything that a human could do.
Largely, yes, except within the constraints of what they could do with the mechanical grasping of different instruments and things like that.
But if you made a nimble enough robot, potentially,
Well,
you're skeptical of that, John?
No. I think robots can do everything that needs to be done. I'm a robotic guy. Humans are a problem. You can train them up to a degree, but a robot will do exactly what you want it to do, and you can test it. And people say, well, if you get the robot there and it runs into a problem. If you had a human there instead, a human could invent a new way of doing it. Well, the human's still limited by whatever tools he has with him, right? But the thing of it is, if the robot fails and it doesn't do what you need to do, you design another robot and put another robot down there. So I think in the end, that's the right approach. But one thing we didn't touch on at all of the discussion, if I could just be part of it,
please.
Putting people on the moon or on Mars or anything is very expensive. Very expensive. And if any of you saw the movie The Martian, you saw all the infrastructure that had been put in place on the surface of Mars to bring the people back. And there was a whole full-stage rocket there, and they had machines that could drive across the surface of Mars at 50 miles an hour. All of that that's what's retaken. So the only way we're going to do that, the government can't do that, I don't think, and the science at some point is going to, lose its import. I think exoplanets is where we'll discover life elsewhere in the universe, not on Mars and not on Enceladus. It's going to mean profit. Somebody has got to come up with a business model that makes going to Mars and going to the moon monetarily worth the investment. And that won't be the government. That's going to be private industry. It's going to be Jeff Bezos or Musk or somebody like that who could figure out a way to make enough money to justify the investment.
So what is the profit potential? I should probably ask you this, Anita, beyond space tourism.
So there's space-based power. I actually think that could be huge, right? Whether it's putting something like massive solar panel farms on the surface of the moon and beaming it back, microwave or lasers, or even in orbit around Earth, and also space-based mining. So there's lots of things you could mine on the moon, nearby asteroids. So I think those two things potentially have a business case. And there's probably a whole bunch we haven't thought about yet.
Well, that's right.
Right. Nathan? Yeah, your question.
Well, we appreciate this event. My question, you've already answered some of it already, but I'll ask it this way. In 1919, we had biplanes. It was right after World War I. In the 50 years, we were able to have almost exponential progress in aerospace technology. We were able to get to the moon. It's been 50 years since then. What happened to the progress?
Great question.
Well,
Peter?
it kind of follows on what we were just talking about here, John and Anita, and that is one of the kind of features of Apollo, as we talked about earlier, was 5% of the budget, as opposed to what NASA is now of 0.5% or something like that. I mean, there's this huge national investment, this huge commitment to see this through. If you look at the public opinion polls, at almost no time did Apollo enjoy the support of the majority of Americans through the 60s. And Congress, at several ventures, the Apollo Flyer for one, but at several other ventures, was very close to pulling the plug on it. And it was only with the moon landing when the public support nudged above 50%, and even then it got up to like 53%.
The greatest technological accomplishment in human history just nudged it above.
Just barely got. And if you look at opinion polls over the intervening 50 years, a minority of the American public is interested in space and interested enough to commit a lot of money to it. And NASA has wrestled with this paradox of, Apollo landing and all this, interest in it, or, the Voyager encounters or Mars rovers, huge apparent public interest. But then how do you sustain that through these intervening times to get us back to the moon and do these things again? Apollo had this, there was a political purpose beyond just public interest. And it was the Cold War, for one. For another, LBJ, which we mentioned, this was a way for him to, you look at where the money was going, and it was going to the South, Houston. Houston, we have a problem. I mean, Houston, there's a reason why it's in Houston, right? It's not a coincidence. So, I mean, there's both a kind of higher Cold War national strategic interest and also a domestic interest in seeing the Apollo program through, and that carried it through these attempts to basically politically pull the plug on it in the 60s and carried it through this apparent lack of public interest. But that's what's up against current proposals to go back to the moon and Mars, is you've somehow got to either, if you're going to do it as a government project, you've got to somehow generate that political support or find other avenues to do it.
Yeah, and John or Anita, do you have any thoughts about how to do that? If you were the president or you were a leader in Congress, is there a way you think you could whip up more public support?
I think the public has decided that about 0.5% of the national budget is the right level of investment for the government to be to participate in. So it brings me right back. It's got to be the public sector.
Private sector.
Private sector. It's got to be a business model that justifies the investment. And the more that the government can do to facilitate that, more the government can do to encourage or enable private investment, that's the right role for government. The science is probably justifiable, but not to the extent that that it will take to make permanent presence on the moon possible, or Mars.
And I'll add to that one additional dimension, because I am an international person myself. I wasn't born here, I came here, and I'm obviously now a naturalized U.S. citizen, but international collaborations. You look around the world, space agencies around the world are kickstarting their ability to send things into orbit, to send people into space. India, they rescheduled their launch. They're launching at, I guess, 2 p.m. Indian Standard Time on Sunday or Monday for their first lunar landed mission. So with international collaboration around the world, all of a sudden you can compile all of the resources together, find out who does what part of the pie, and then I think you can make this happen as a global endeavor, because it's for people, it's for human beings, not just Americans.
Thank you again so much. It's been wonderful. Thank you all for coming out and joining us. We appreciate it very much. Again, if you want to see the video or share with friends or family members, if you enjoyed the program, you can send them to kpcc.org to watch the video or to listen to the program. Have a great weekend, and thank you as always for coming out. We appreciate it.